Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. She was found lying on concrete, neck wrapped with a garden hose. No stool, no platform, just a woman dead behind a jewelry shop and a husband who said she did it to herself. In towns like Somerville, South Carolina, death doesn't come like this, especially not for someone like Sara Lynn Moore Colucci. May 20th, 2015. 6:18 p.m. First responders were dispatched to a small warehouse lot behind Colucci Jewelers on North Main Street, a commercial corridor lined with family-run businesses and strip malls. The call came in as an unconscious female, potential suicide by hanging. The caller was her husband, Michael Colucci. When medics arrived, they found Sara Lynn Moore Colucci on her back. The garden hose that had allegedly taken her life was wrapped around her neck, looped once through a horizontal slat in a nearby chain-link fence, and cinched tight. Her hands were limp. No nearby object could have elevated her. The hose hung loosely without significant tension. Her legs were flat on the ground. The positioning was anatomically inconsistent with suspension. The lead medic later documented, "No point of anchoring for body weight, no evidence of an actual drop. Very low probability of suicide by hanging." Michael Colucci stood nearby, his shirt slightly stained, his voice controlled but rushed. He told officers he and his wife had driven to their warehouse that afternoon. She went to use the restroom inside. He waited in the car. After 15 to 20 minutes, he got out to check on her and found her like this. According to the official incident log, he claimed she had taken her own life with a hose she found on site, that she had been upset lately and had trauma in her past. On the surface, the scene suggested self-harm, but investigators would soon notice inconsistencies in both setting and statement, details that began to form a different picture, one where nothing quite lined up. The victim was Sara Lynn Moore Colucci, 38 years old. Recently relocated to Somerville, she worked alongside her husband managing the family jewelry business. A soft-spoken woman, she was known to close friends as sensitive but composed. She had endured loss. Her first husband had died by suicide nearly a decade earlier, but no one recalled her expressing anything close to suicidal ideation in recent months. She still went to work, maintained social ties, and had future plans. The location of her death, a fenced area behind a warehouse attached to their store, was not a residence, not private, not symbolic. There was no note, no medication containers, no signs of hesitation. Deputies cordoned off the area. A forensic technician arrived shortly after 7 p.m. and photographed the entire scene. Measurements were taken. The hose in question was standard green rubber, coiled but not mounted. No fingerprints other than Sarah's and Michael's were recovered from the segment used. While paramedics noted bruising and light swelling around Sarah's face, it wasn't immediately classified as trauma inconsistent with hanging. It would take a full autopsy to determine whether her injuries aligned with asphyxiation by suspension or by something else entirely. And something else would come. Michael's statement was taken at the scene and again at the station. Both times he insisted he had no knowledge of his wife's intentions. He said she had been quiet all day, but not openly distressed. He described their marriage as mostly stable. He offered no explanation as to how Sara could have hoisted herself up or where she would have learned the mechanics of such an act. Officers noted minor scratches on his forearms. He said they came from moving a storage bin earlier. When asked whether he had touched the hose after finding her, he nodded. "Yeah, I tried to get her down," he told them. "I tried CPR. It was too late." The EMTs who arrived first on scene later expressed doubt. The marks didn't match, one would report. And CPR? If he did it, it wasn't effective. But I'm not even sure he tried. By midnight, Sarah's body had been transferred to the Charleston County Coroner's Office. An autopsy was scheduled for the next morning. At that point, the case remained open but unsuspicious. But as one investigator wrote in his field notes, the data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that's the problem. In criminal investigations, background isn't filler. It's evidence. Context becomes the silent witness. In the case of Sara Lynn Moore Colucci, that context spanned 2 marriages, 1 suicide, a shift in behavior, and the quiet erosion of personal autonomy over time. Sara Lynn Moore was born in 1977 and raised in the Carolinas. She graduated high school in Rock Hill, South Carolina, and earned an associate's degree in business administration from a local college. Friends described her as composed, deliberate, and slow to trust. There were no juvenile incidents, no mental health red flags on record before adulthood. She married young, at 25, to Brandon Moore, a man who, by all accounts, was erratic, possessive, and volatile. Their marriage ended abruptly in 2007 when Brandon died by suicide after a long period of emotional instability. There was no foul play suspected, and Sara was never implicated in any wrongdoing. In the years following, she relocated to Somerville and found part-time work in a small boutique. That's where she met Michael Colucci, a local jeweler known for his custom design work and family-owned store, Colucci Jewelers. They began dating in 2010 and married in 2011. From the outside, their relationship appeared stable. Financial records show they co-owned 2 vehicles, a home in the Cane Bay subdivision, and had no shared children. Sara didn't have any arrests, and her driving record was clean. There was no documented domestic violence, no calls to law enforcement from their home. But absence of record doesn't always mean absence of risk. The first anomaly arose when investigators requested medical and counseling records. A 2014 intake form from a private therapist in North Charleston indicated Sara had expressed feelings of being isolated and overmanaged. She did not follow up after 2 sessions. No diagnosis was made. Notes from the therapist described her demeanor as guarded but functional. Colleagues at Colucci Jewelers said Sara rarely spoke unless spoken to and often deferred to Michael during customer interactions. One former employee told detectives she seemed tense but careful, like she was always trying not to upset anyone. Investigators flagged one financial pattern. Although Sara was listed as co-owner of the business, she never signed outgoing checks. Michael controlled payroll, vendor payments, and inventory procurement. Sara's access to the business email was limited to a secondary inbox. From a forensic standpoint, this isn't inherently criminal. But in homicide investigations, controlling behavior in life can mirror controlling behavior in death. Investigators then turned to digital communications. A warrant for phone records revealed that in the 30 days prior to her death, Sara had exchanged frequent messages with 2 friends from high school. These were recovered via subpoena from the mobile carrier. One message, dated May 12, 2015, read, "Sometimes I feel like if I left, no one would even notice. Or worse, they'd be angry." No response followed. Her last outgoing text, sent 28 hours before her death, simply said, "I can't take it here anymore. I might stay at the shop late tomorrow." To the uninformed, the message might have sounded vague, but to investigators, it flagged possible staging. Staying at the shop alone meant being isolated, vulnerable. The question became, did she intend to stay late, or was she trying to create distance from someone? While the toxicology report was still pending, forensic analysts began pulling surveillance metadata. No interior cameras were present at the rear warehouse lot where she died, but a nearby business, 2 doors down, had an exterior motion-activated camera. It captured a vehicle arriving just after 6:10 p.m. on May 20th, Colucci's silver Toyota Highlander. Investigators confirmed the plate. What stood out wasn't the arrival, but the absence of departure. According to the camera's timestamp, no vehicle left until paramedics arrived. No strangers entered. No third party emerged. If there was a confrontation, it had happened with only one other person nearby. That's when detectives began compiling an internal profile, not of Sara, but of her patterns: emotional withdrawal, isolation, financial passivity, low visibility. Combined, these don't prove intent or violence, but they establish a life increasingly diminished behind the walls of a shared business. One investigator wrote, "She didn't leave tracks. That makes reconstruction harder, but not impossible." The forensic discovery anchoring this chapter wasn't dramatic. It was subtle. There was no blood, no weapon, no forced entry. But the absence of voice, no 911 call from Sara, no outreach to coworkers, no digital planning, left behind a different kind of evidence: behavioral silence. And when that silence is surrounded by control, it stops looking like withdrawal. It starts to resemble suppression. By the evening of May 21st, 2015, Less than 24 hours after the discovery of Sara Lynn Moore Colucci's body, Somerville police had completed a full photographic sweep of the warehouse lot. The visual record alone didn't tell a complete story, but certain physical details already challenged the central premise of what had been reported, that Sara had hanged herself using a garden hose tied to a chain-link fence. The problem was mechanical. According to standard death investigation protocols, suicide by hanging involves suspension, partial or full. Either the full body weight is used to constrict the neck, or partial suspension requires elevation of at least the upper torso to apply pressure. In this case, Sara was found flat on her back, legs fully extended, hose loosely looped once over a horizontal fence rail, and resting against the back of her neck. The hose itself had no knots beyond a crude single-loop tie. It had not been pulled taut. The fence, made of aluminum with vinyl coating, showed no drag marks or tension grooves. The soil underneath was undisturbed. A full-body diagram was created by the forensics team to map all contact points. No elevation platform, no chair, no bucket, no crate was found in the immediate vicinity. The hose was a standard 5/8-inch garden line. Detectives later located the packaging in a nearby trash receptacle. It was purchased within the last 48 hours, still coiled, still retaining its manufactured shape. A receipt recovered from the warehouse office confirmed the purchase was made by the business account, 2 days before Sara's death. The timeline raised the first critical question: why was a hose newly purchased if none had been reported damaged or stolen? And why was it accessible, unused, and loosely placed until it was found around a dead woman's neck? Forensic investigators sent the hose for lab analysis. DNA swabs confirmed Sara's epithelial cells. Michael Colucci's DNA was also present, on the section nearest the improvised loop and in faint quantities along its midpoint. Detectives noted the hose showed no sign of tearing, fraying, or trauma consistent with struggle. But the location of the hose in the photos didn't match the natural path a self-suspension would cause. It had too much slack. There was no leverage point, no marks on the inside of the fence, no drag on the body. The technical term used in the autopsy's preliminary notation: asphyxia by ligature compression, non-suspension. Autopsy photographs revealed periocular petechiae, small hemorrhages in the eyes, typically present in manual strangulation or compression asphyxiation. But there were no fingernail abrasions, no defensive wounds, no clear finger marks. Just uniform bruising around the anterior and lateral portions of the neck. The bruising was symmetrical, with concentrated pressure on the left side, not something usually caused by gravity from a vertical drop. A single-handed pull could have created that pattern. That required force, not just intent. The medical examiner noted additional injuries: superficial abrasions on Sara's knees and forearms, suggesting brief contact with rough concrete. The abrasions were dry by the time paramedics arrived. That indicated the wounds were sustained at least 20 to 30 minutes before discovery. Her time of death, calculated from core body temperature and livor mortis patterns, was estimated between 5:45 and 6:01 p.m. Michael Colucci's 911 call was logged at 6:18 p.m. That left a gap. Digital forensics analysts reviewed Michael's phone. GPS data placed him at the warehouse lot at 5:42 p.m. Call records show no outgoing communications between 5:40 and 6:15 p.m. A text draft in his phone's memory, unsent, read, "Here now. She's going to finish inventory." That message was time-stamped at 5:46 p.m. Detectives compiled these details into what they referred to internally as Timeline Packet A. Each minute was accounted for. None of it added weight to a suicide narrative. The logistical inconsistencies, the absence of elevation, the clean loop, the undisturbed ground, built a profile not of depression, but of manipulation. Still, law enforcement hadn't made an arrest. They needed something more conclusive than just absence of plausibility. That came from the autopsy's secondary toxicology screen. Sara's blood alcohol content was 0.22, nearly 3 times the legal driving limit. Cocaine metabolites were present in moderate concentration. No sedatives, no antidepressants. Her stomach contents showed light food residue, consistent with reports that she ate lunch around 2 hours p.m. that day. The cocaine level introduced a complicating factor. It suggested recent use, but not necessarily her own. Investigators did not find paraphernalia at the scene, nor on her body. The hose, meanwhile, had no chemical residue. The blood alcohol could have impaired her motor skills, but it also increased the risk of fatal overdose under stress or duress. Still, she had managed to walk, change her shoes, and carry items inside the warehouse earlier that day. Surveillance from earlier in the afternoon, recovered from the front lot, showed her clearly exiting the vehicle, opening the warehouse door, and re-emerging briefly to bring in a small box. She was steady, not staggering, not incoherent. A woman this impaired would have struggled to execute a clean, coordinated self-hanging, especially one that left no DNA except her own and one other person's. The investigators circled one word in their timeline packet: staging. Sara's phone was locked when recovered. After court authorization, its unlock pattern was bypassed. The last app opened, Google Maps. A saved location in her history read, La Quinta Inn, North Charleston. That hotel was not associated with any family travel. It was known locally as an extended stay spot. Room records were subpoenaed. No reservation matched her name, but a man checked in with cash on May 18th using a local address, later identified as a former employee of Colucci Jewelers. That lead, while not directly tied to the crime scene, introduced another layer. Was Sara planning to leave? Law enforcement kept that angle open. In the field notes, one detective summarized the case status. The scene was sterile, but not clean. No visible mess, but all details controlled. Too controlled. It was a short paragraph, but it underscored the central concern. When a death looks neat, but the mechanics don't support the story, it's rarely an accident. In homicide investigations, timeline discrepancies aren't just procedural issues. They're structural fractures. And in the death of Sara Lynn Moore Colucci, the cracks began with her husband's version of events. Documented, time-stamped, and, in critical ways, uncorroborated. Michael Colucci provided his first statement at the scene within 90 minutes of his wife's death. That account would later be re-examined under controlled interview conditions by SLED agents. Both versions, scene-side and formal, were internally consistent, but against the forensic record, they presented measurable problems. According to Michael, he and Sara arrived at the warehouse around 5:30 p.m. He claimed she went inside to check stock. He stayed in the SUV. When 20 minutes passed without her return, he stepped out to look for her. That's when, according to his narrative, he discovered her behind the building. Unresponsive, hose around her neck. No signs of movement. He said he tried CPR but didn't call 911 immediately. He walked back to the car first, retrieved his phone, and placed the call at 6:18 p.m. The issue was that GPS and cellular tower pings painted a tighter, more troubling picture. Michael's phone arrived at the warehouse lot at 5:42 p.m. He never left the premises during the next 40 minutes. There was no recorded movement, no drive-off, no change in location. GPS drift remained within a 6-meter radius, which matched the passenger side area of the SUV. A motion detector from the back corner of the warehouse, installed by the prior tenant and still active, showed activation at 5:48 p.m., then again at 6:03 p.m. Those entries correlated to pedestrian movement, likely a person walking through the alleyway connecting the back entrance to the fenced area where Sara was found. A forensic analyst flagged the motion timestamps because they didn't align with Michael's account of sitting idle for 20 minutes. If his statement was accurate, either someone else was back there, or he moved and didn't report it. Adding to the inconsistency, no fingerprints, other than Michael's and Sara's, were recovered from the hose, fence, or immediate surroundings. No footwear impressions outside the couples matched the site. No signs of forced entry or third-party interference existed. When questioned again 5 days after the incident, Michael's statement shifted slightly. He now said he might have stepped out of the car once before finding her, maybe to stretch or get some air. This contradicted his original claim of remaining inside the SUV the entire time. The change wasn't large, but in criminal investigations, minor alterations often signal concealed awareness. Further complicating his timeline, surveillance footage from the front of the lot showed Michael stepping out of the driver's side door at 6:01 p.m., wiping his hands with what appeared to be a paper towel. He re-entered the vehicle, then exited again 7 minutes later, just before dialing 911. The footage didn't show panic. There was no running, no urgent movement toward the scene of a traumatic discovery. At no point in the available footage did he visibly call for help before placing the emergency call. Investigators reviewed his phone's metadata. No outgoing texts. No attempt to reach Sara by call, even after noting her absence. No searches related to CPR. No voice memos or quick photos, despite the fact that his device had a camera and had been used multiple times earlier that day. To forensic analysts, this wasn't evidence of guilt, but it was evidence of behavioral improbability. The SUV itself, a silver Toyota Highlander, was processed for trace evidence. No blood. No visible biological material. One pair of nitrile gloves was found in the glove compartment. These were common in jewelry repair, and their presence wasn't suspicious on its own, but they were unused. A partial box sat in the warehouse office. None were found in the trash, nor nearby the scene. During voluntary questioning, Michael stated he never touched the hose after finding Sara, except to try to lift her shoulders during CPR. He said he panicked and didn't remember every movement. His shirt, seized by officers at the station, had faint smudges across the collar. DNA analysis confirmed Sara's skin cells. That part aligned with attempted contact, but the sequence of that contact remained in question. The coroner's office completed its secondary report by May 26. The window of time between estimated death and the call was reaffirmed, 18 to 30 minutes. This lined up with motion sensor logs and thermal imaging data. Her body temperature at the scene was measured at 87.1 degrees. Given ambient weather and wind exposure, that corresponded with a death time no later than 5:50 p.m. Michael's call came in at 6:18. This raised a core procedural question. What happened during the 28-minute gap between death and emergency response? In forensic timelines, unexplained silence often matters more than noise. And here the silence was layered. No movement alerts in the front lot, no phone use, no physical response until just before the call was made. Investigators documented that gap as Phase D, their internal designation for time windows unaccounted for by credible witness action. In most civilian-involved death scenes, emergency contact is immediate, especially with spouses, especially with asphyxiation. The delay, even if not criminal, was highly atypical. A behavioral analysis report issued by SLED in early June 2015 categorized Michael's conduct as non-reactive, with measured affect. It stopped short of psychological profiling, but noted a mismatch between stress indicators and expected distress. Investigators knew that this alone couldn't sustain a prosecution. Behavior is not proof, but when behavior contradicts the physical timeline, and when the narrative morphs under scrutiny, the case stops being a question of what happened and becomes a question of why it was presented this way. Autopsy doesn't offer motive. It doesn't reveal intent or guilt. But when everything else is unclear, the body tells the part of the story that cannot lie. Sara Lynn Moore Colucci's post-mortem examination began on the morning of May 21, 2015, under the direction of Charleston County's chief medical examiner. Preliminary assessments at the scene had already ruled out typical suspension-based hanging due to body positioning and environmental context. The autopsy would now focus on validating cause of death and uncovering any hidden trauma that visual inspection missed. The cause listed asphyxia due to neck compression. The manner? Undetermined, pending further evidence. Sara's hyoid bone, the small U-shaped bone in the neck often fractured during manual strangulation, was intact. That ruled out a violent chokehold with the bare hands, but it didn't eliminate ligature force. What the examiner found instead were uniform abrasions across the anterior and lateral neck, consistent with pressure applied by a wide, flexible object. A garden hose matched that profile, yet the abrasion pattern told more than what was used. It told how. The compression marks were deeper on the left side, slightly off-center, angled upward. That directional pressure, combined with the absence of body weight support, suggested she was either held down or the ligature was pulled while she remained grounded. There was no sign of rotation in the marks, no upward tension path that would align with self-suspension. She didn't fall into the hose. The hose compressed around her, bruising on the knees and outer forearms, partially healed, pointed to a brief physical altercation or forceful movement. There was no pattern to suggest restraint. More likely, they came from brief contact with concrete, possibly during a fall or struggle. The forensic team noted these injuries occurred before death. One notable absence was particularly telling. No petechial hemorrhaging in the eyes. The red spots often caused by prolonged oxygen deprivation under high pressure. Instead, there was conjunctival pallor. The asphyxia was rapid, sudden. There was no drawn-out fight for breath, just silence. Toxicology results provided additional context, not conclusions. Sara's blood alcohol concentration registered at 0.222. Cocaine metabolites were also present. Those findings meant her cognitive and motor functions were likely impaired. She may not have been able to resist. That fact doesn't determine criminality, but it does reshape possibilities. Impairment doesn't equal intent. There was also no defensive DNA under her fingernails. No evidence she had tried to claw or grab at the hose. Whether that meant she was compliant, too intoxicated, or surprised remained unclear. But one thing was certain. The position and nature of her injuries did not support a self-inflicted mechanism. Investigators referred back to the hose itself. No bruising matched the raised ridges, typical of that particular brand. That meant pressure had likely been applied using one of the smooth sides, or with additional fabric or padding. That modification wasn't accounted for in Michael Colucci's initial explanation of how she allegedly took her own life. Another item surfaced during tissue examination: faint contusions at the back of the scalp, partially hidden by the hairline. Not sharp enough to indicate blunt force trauma, but present. A compression injury, likely caused by impact with the ground or a hard object during the asphyxiation event. Put simply, Sara had sustained injuries not explained by a fall, and her cause of death couldn't be supported by her positioning at the scene. No ligature alone tells the full story, but this one narrowed the possibilities. A supplemental report was issued 5 days after the full autopsy. The examiner's note was brief but clear: compression pattern inconsistent with self-application. Force applied laterally with inconsistent tension. Cause of death: asphyxia due to external ligature. Manner: pending investigation. That phrase, pending investigation, would remain for years. But for the forensic team, the conclusion was reached that day. Not legally, not officially, but medically. Sara Lynn Moore Colucci did not die by accident, and she did not die alone. By mid-2016, over a year after the death of Sara Lynn Moore Colucci, the investigation had reached what investigators call evidentiary saturation. No new witnesses, no unknown DNA, no additional surveillance. But what they did have was a stack of inconsistencies, physical evidence that directly contradicted the reported cause of death, and a growing sense that the window for accountability was closing. Berkeley County authorities made the decision to charge Michael Colucci with murder in the first degree. The indictment was filed in the fall. He was arrested without incident and released on bond days later. No flight risk, no prior criminal history. Just a man who, until then, had continued operating his business with near-complete normalcy. The state's case leaned heavily on circumstantial evidence, an approach prosecutors don't prefer but often have to work with. They had the autopsy, which concluded ligature asphyxia inconsistent with self-infliction. They had motion sensor logs, location data, and inconsistencies in Michael's timeline. And they had expert testimony from the state's forensic pathologist confirming that the pattern of bruising and directional pressure couldn't be self-applied. But what they didn't have was a confession. No eyewitness, no direct forensic link proving intent, no prior threats, and crucially, no clear motive. Jury selection began in early 2018. The courtroom was tense but quiet. Media coverage had been limited outside of regional news. Sara's family sat together in the gallery each day. Michael remained composed throughout proceedings, flanked by 2 attorneys and a defense strategy built around doubt. The defense emphasized the presence of alcohol and cocaine in Sara's system. They framed her as emotionally vulnerable and possibly self-destructive, pointing to her history of trauma from a prior relationship and sporadic therapy sessions. While the prosecution had the autopsy, the defense had ambiguity. They questioned the timeline. Was Michael really in control of every minute? Could the pressure bruising have resulted from uncoordinated movements in a state of intoxication? Was the delay in calling 911 negligence, not malice? The most difficult challenge for the jury was that none of the evidence individually felt definitive. The crime scene didn't scream violence. The body bore no signs of a prolonged struggle. There was no weapon, no note. And the narrative, though riddled with doubt, lacked a dramatic element that often compels conviction. After 6 days of testimony and nearly 2 full days of deliberation, the jury returned with no verdict. It was a hung jury. The judge declared a mistrial. 9 voted for guilt. 3 did not. The trial ended without a resolution. The prosecution had the option to retry, but not immediately. Legally, the mistrial didn't clear the defendant, but functionally, it stalled the case. Time would now work against the state. Witness memories would degrade. Jurors would be harder to find, and public interest would wane. For Sara's family, it wasn't a moment of relief. It was a void. The case remained open. Michael was released under the same bond conditions. No new charges were filed. The evidence didn't change, but the strategy would have to. Prosecutors returned to their files, looking for missed angles, items not emphasized enough the first time, behavioral patterns, financial control, new forensic interpretation. Over the following years, the case sat in procedural limbo, legally active, tactically stagnant, and for a long time that's where it stayed. But cases like this don't really go cold. They just get quiet until someone finds the right way to make them hurt again. After the mistrial in 2018, the case file for Sara Lynn Moore Colucci was labeled pending retrial and stored under restricted access at the Berkeley County Solicitor's Office. No new arrests, no announcements, no resolution. For nearly 5 years, the case moved only on paper. Its progress stalled not by evidence, but by strategic hesitation. From a legal perspective, this wasn't unusual. Prosecutors in South Carolina, as in most jurisdictions, are hesitant to retry a murder case without new leverage, either stronger forensic support or a cooperating witness. Neither had emerged. The physical evidence hadn't changed. The defendant hadn't recanted or confessed. The public hadn't demanded anything new. But inside the community, silence doesn't mean absence. Sara's family kept asking questions. They filed repeated requests for updates, pushed for a renewed forensic review, and reached out to local media, which occasionally published updates that amounted to little more than status unchanged. Behind the scenes, pressure was mounting. In 2021, a newly elected sheriff, Dwayne Lewis, made public safety reform and cold case transparency part of his campaign platform. Though Sara's case was never technically cold, it hadn't moved in years. Under Lewis's direction, the file was reassessed. A review panel from the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division, SLED, was assigned to re-examine the evidence, not to reinvestigate the crime, but to determine whether anything had been missed or misinterpreted in the original analysis. Their conclusion wasn't dramatic, but it was decisive. The original autopsy remained sound. The mechanism of death, compression by ligature without suspension, was still inconsistent with suicide. But now they added a crucial detail. The time of death estimate could be refined using updated body cooling algorithms that factored in microclimate and substrate heat absorption. When recalculated, Sara's estimated time of death shifted earlier by 12 minutes, placing it closer to 5:38 p.m. That difference may seem minor, but it directly impacted Michael Colucci's window of explanation. His vehicle GPS placed him at the lot at 5:42 p.m., but the revised model now suggested Sara had been dead for 4 full minutes by the time he arrived. Or he had already been there, and the timeline was inaccurate. This discrepancy prompted SLED to subpoena Michael's smartphone forensically, again. Using updated extraction tools, analysts recovered deleted data from a secured folder. It contained 2 unsent text drafts, both time-stamped at 5:33 p.m. "She's not listening again. I'm done. If she keeps talking like that, I'm leaving her here." Neither message was ever sent, but their existence proved the device had been unlocked and in use at a time that directly conflicted with Michael's claim of sitting silently in the car, unaware of Sara's whereabouts. Legally, the texts weren't a confession, but procedurally, they changed the posture of the case. By late 2022, the solicitor's office initiated the first steps toward re-indictment. They requested supplemental testimony from the original forensic pathologist, along with updated motion sensor interpretation and thermal imaging recalibration from the crime scene team. In early 2023, an internal memo from the prosecution's lead investigator was leaked. It read, "We do not need a new crime scene. We need a jury willing to hear the one we already documented, with the full story, not just the sanitized version." That story included more than just timelines and bruising. It included a marriage where control had replaced intimacy, finances where one name appeared but the other one signed, a warehouse no longer used for business but for distance. It had taken nearly a decade to understand what some had suspected early, that the crime scene wasn't just physical, it was relational. There's a cost to waiting years for justice. Evidence degrades. People move on. Public interest fades. But time also reveals what's durable. In Sara's case, it was the consistency of her silence, contrasted with the shifting of everyone else's story. The retrial of Michael Colucci began on June 16, 2025 in the Berkeley County Courthouse. 10 years had passed since the death of Sara Lynn Moore Colucci. 10 years since she was found behind the jewelry warehouse with a hose around her neck and silence surrounding every detail that followed. Inside the courtroom, much had changed since the original trial in 2018. The prosecution was no longer relying on the emotional weight of doubt alone. This time, their case was focused. Built on updated forensic modeling, recovered digital data, and refined timelines that redefined what had once seemed inconclusive. The jury was seated by noon. 9 men and 3 women, none of whom had served in the previous trial. Opening statements were short, direct. The state presented their theory not with drama, but with documentation. They focused on data. The newly calculated time of death window, revised downward by 12 minutes using microclimate-adjusted body cooling metrics, shifted the entire framework. It placed Sara's time of death before Michael's confirmed GPS arrival, unless the prior location ping had been falsified or misread. The defense challenged the credibility of the temperature model, but forensic specialists stood by its margin of error and peer-reviewed methodology. More critical, however, was the digital evidence recovered from Michael's phone, a cache of deleted draft messages that, while unsent, were time-stamped in a window previously claimed to be one of ignorance. In one of them, Michael referred to Sara in past tense. Investigators testified that the only way the message could have existed at that moment was if the device had been actively used while Sara was either unconscious or already dead. The court allowed the messages to be entered into evidence. While they weren't confessions, they provided a subtle but crucial fracture in the defense's timeline. The prosecution used them to draw attention not to a moment of rage, but to something colder, the potential premeditation of detachment. The defense repeated its original position, that the scene was consistent with suicide, exacerbated by intoxication, emotional instability, and lack of intervention. They leaned heavily on character history, bringing in therapists and acquaintances who testified that Sara had expressed feelings of isolation. But under cross-examination, each witness admitted those conversations were years old, vague, and never involved any plan, method, or indication of violent intent. What didn't appear in court this time was drama. No shouting, no breakdowns, just 2 narratives placed side by side, one backed by data, the other by theory. The final day of evidence concluded on June 17, 2025. As of this writing, the jury is deliberating. No verdict has been reached, and perhaps that's where the case for now belongs, not in the category of conclusion, but in that space between what can be proved and what can be known. Because what this case has shown, over 10 years, 2 trials, and a community's long endurance, is that forensic science can explain how someone died, but it rarely explains why no one else acted sooner. Not in the moment, not in the years that followed. Sara's family has remained consistent in their pursuit, not for vengeance, but for clarity. In their statements to the press, they've rarely spoken of Michael by name. Instead, they've spoken of silence, of systems that hesitate when certainty is inconvenient, of the weight of a case that was never declared cold, but never fully pursued either. And in that, this story becomes larger than a warehouse, a marriage, or a single act of violence. It becomes about latency, how long it takes the truth to push its way through the cracks of an imperfect process. There is no justice without persistence, and no justice system functions without pressure. Sara's case, unresolved but not abandoned, reminds us that sometimes silence is not absence. It's what justice sounds like when it's delayed. Sometimes justice takes years, not because people forget, but because they remember too well. After walking you through this case, I've realized that truth isn't just about evidence. It's about persistence, about refusing to let silence win. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's this. Speak up even when it's hard, because someone's life may depend on it. What do you think justice looks like in a case like this? Did something in this story resonate with your own experiences or community? I'd love to hear where you're watching from and how this story made you feel. If this video reached you in any way, please consider subscribing to the channel so you won't miss the next story that needs to be told.